So yeah, this is part one. It's gonna be a bit of theory and then a couple hands because that's what you like, right?
Maybe. We'll see. We'll see.
Right. Yeah, and one thing, please use the Discord if you have some questions, feedback, and that stuff. I think it's better than using the Zoom chat. So just type something there in ongoing webinar chat channel. Okay, let's go.
So, yeah, this is the channel. Somebody's wondering what Pavel means. This is the channel. Okay, so
Shalek is already there.
Shalek is there. That's good.
Shalek is already there, starting the party.
ICM when not. Yeah, that's a funny question. Okay, Pavel has created a small, short presentation for us to cover our bases. How, when, and when not, and what is ICM. We're not going to spend an awful lot of time on this, but a few pointers. I'm sure most, if not all of you, are aware of what the independent chip model stands for. The first point being that it's a static model, and that's probably worth bringing up because ICM keeps being misunderstood by many people because what it is, like ICM was developed for horse racing. We should never forget that. It was not developed for the complexity of the poker game. It is the best model that we have so far, but it is extremely static. It's basically, I think the best metaphor that I've heard about it was from Federholt, who mentioned that he views ICM as a lottery system. And that's what it is. Like when you run a sim under ICM conditions, what the formula does or what the solver does is it assigns every stack a number of tickets, and then it starts drawing probabilities of each ticket holder finishing in a certain place. So keep that in mind. Just in general, it is a very, very robust system, and it just doesn't meet the dynamics of an actual poker game. It does ignore skill advantages, disadvantages, it ignores positions and future game. There are admittedly future game simulations, but those are useful in a very limited capacity. Like future game simulations will be useful for spots where we have a lot of short stacks, because with the future game, what happens is, sure, the solver looks a few hands in the future, but it looks as if the solver plays versus itself. So it gives us a little bit of an idea, but if we're looking at a normal table where, let's say we have like a normal final table, the average stack is 20, 30 picks, there is not going to be an awful lot of stacking of preflop, etc. FGS just doesn't tell us a whole lot. If it's like a satellite where everybody has 3 bigs and when you're going to be getting in, sure, but since the solver in the future game bit just simulates if people are going to get money in but playing only versus itself, it still cannot account for skill advantages, for how people deviate, etc., etc. A very important bit.
Sorry, isn't like only gem or fold, right, in the future game simulations?
Yeah, exactly.
It's only gem or fold, so pretty limited. And like maximum number of hands you can simulate to the future is, I don't know, 5 maybe, if you have like pretty good PC.
Yeah, if you have a super powerful server, maybe you can simulate 5, but yeah, it's going to take forever, and the results won't be exceptionally useful because of how limited the game tree is in the future hands.
Yeah, exactly.
And it is a very sad thing, but ICM model does make you money by folding. That's a fairly straightforward concept. In GPV environments, folding can never yield you money, whereas in an ICM environment, and this is like, we can even talk beyond ICM in like a more dynamic future game environment, folding when chips have non-linear value. So one chip is not $1 or whatever, is gonna be making you money because other people play, they exchange chips between themselves, your stack may grow in value. And yeah, it is what makes ICM, or this is probably the bit which creates one of the biggest misconceptions, that ICM just means play tight. It doesn't mean that, but we'll get into it in a bit. And yeah, as mentioned already, it does have a lot of flaws, but it's a working model, right? We're not trying to copy ICM. We're not trying to blindly remember ranges. We're not trying to just play exactly how the model suggests, because the model is imperfect and there are many, many factors. However, it is still exceptionally useful to develop a very deep understanding of the model and what adjustments it generates, because one, when you understand the model, you know what your high level opponents are thinking of, which is good, because when you know what they're thinking of, you can then try to implement adjustments based on that. Like, is somebody like playing very close to what they consider to be correct ICM strategy, then maybe you get to push them around a bit more. Or is somebody completely disregarding ICM? You know, the most famous example being Sam Greenwood, who, you know, we've seen a lot of Sam Greenwood. Sam Greenwood is one of the best players in the world, and we've seen many, many replays with him where he apparently doesn't seem to believe in many of the tighter stack of suggestions of ICM, etc., etc. Point being, it's not a perfect model and it has flaws, but it doesn't mean it's not worth studying it. It's still the one thing that we have, and everything from there is art. But in order for us to implement the artistry, we need to figure out what are the current boundaries and within what boundaries does the game evolve. So yeah, the idea is to develop heuristics, understand how the solver thinks, what are the patterns and ideas that we can generate from those simulations, and then extrapolate that into the real world, which is what poker study is all about, really. It's never, pretty much no solver can give you an exact solution for a spot in terms of there are always differences. You're never playing versus a computer. You're never playing the exact same spot twice, etc., etc. So after this long, wounded introduction, a couple of math slides, shall I call them. This is a very brief thing. I'm not sure how people are used to thinking about it, but the two main things we think about risk premiums are bubble factor and, you know, the actual equity risk premium. Solvers nowadays, HRC and ICMizer, all the solvers generate these bubble factors, and they translate to a certain amount of risk premium. Simply put, this is the amount of additional equity we need to stack off compared to a GPP distribution. So let's say we have ace king and we have the highest, or one of the highest possible, you know, like 25% risk premium. If we have ace king and somebody has a pair and we're with that risk premium, we don't want to stack it, right? We just don't have the equity. And like, that's not even an extreme example. You can make a lot of extreme examples. You may have pocket tens and somebody shows you, you know their cards. You have pocket tens, the other guy shows you ace four suited, and you have to fold just because you don't have the equity. It's a simple thing where you take the GPV equity and you see, I have a 20% risk premium. What does that mean in terms of how much, what are my equity thresholds for risking all of my chips? And there's this beautiful graph here, which shows you exactly that. And I think if you don't have this, we can share it with you for sure. We have a bunch of, like, basically this chart, fairly easy to understand. And then this is just an example of what the solvers output. Like, the solvers don't, I'm not sure, I don't think any solver outputs risk premium in terms of percentages. I think they mostly output this. So this is an example from an HRC. If you're not sure where to find it, it's here. So in the hand, show bubble factors. See this. But this is just a random hand, which we're not going to be looking at today, but just in case someone is not sure where to find them in HRC. And in ICMizer, they just appear in a lot more visible spot. If I remember correctly, there is a number right next to the stack.
Yeah, it's a weird choice for them not showing the risk premium and showing bubble factor instead. I mean, for me personally, a risk premium gives like more information, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
And
like,
we show risk premium in Preflop Academy.
Risk premium is shown in Preflop, and it is a lot easier. Here you can see it, bubble factor and risk premium. I guess it's just one of those things where one person started doing it in a certain way, and then everybody does it the same way, even though it's not the best way. Because for me, thinking in terms of what is my risk premium has always been the way to go, because sure, I may have a general idea of what my bubble factor is, but it doesn't really help me as much. You know, if I know my bubble factor is 1.8 and I'm not sure what that means in terms of how much more equity I need, it really doesn't help me at all, does it? Like, I have a 1.7 bubble factor, so what? You know, how does that help my in-game decision making?
Yeah, but this is our general thinking about the game very often too, in terms of equities, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And here we have a couple of examples to basically showcase what we meant before that and showcase how Preflop Academy actually has a lot of tools that can help us improve both our just general heuristics and studying for ICM, but also just checking hands. We'll get to the hands in a bit. So here we have an example of big stack, big or mid stack versus a big stack, and you have a GPV comparison versus the ICM comparison and how ranges look. So here you have a standard on the right hand side for the big blinds, cutover versus 3-bet from button, GPV, lots of calling. This is a 3-betting range. You know, everybody's pretty used to that. And on the left hand side, we have the ICM scenario. So if we open Preflop Academy, so that first, okay, I'll exit this for a bit. You go ICM. It was, where is it? Where is it?
It was 8 max.
It was 8 max.
Yeah.
Or this one. You go here. You go versus 3-bet, cutover versus button. No, it.
Not this one.
Oh, this one.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So this is what we were looking at here, and here you click this, you find all the risk premiums, you find all the bubble factors, and this is the type of thing which helps us figure out heuristics. You know, this is just one example, but even from this one example, we can start to gain some understanding. First things first, versus the button cutoff has a pretty high bubble factor. You need 17% more, so 70% risk premium. All of the borderline calls are stripped out. All of them, just none. All those beautiful Jack 9 suited and Jack 10 suited and all of that is gone. You see a bit more shoving in terms of blockers, although not a whole lot more compared to GPV. You see less shoving here in the Jacks for 9s department, and we see about the same here. The main thing being, how do we think about ranges again? Because one, there is the risk premium, but two, there is check out the impositions ranges. Very common thing in ICM. You'll see a lot of blockers being used compared to all of these playable hands in GPV, etc., etc. And even looking just at these two spots, it's a 40 big blind effective scenario where the guy who is facing the 3-bet is under a lot of pressure because they're covered. Admittedly, the cutoff can cause a lot of pain to the button and all of that, but for now, let's just stick to the model. Just looking at these type of spots and going through them and like saying, let's try to figure out how does big versus big stack play, high risk premiums. We can open Preflop Academy. We can run our sims, of course, but these are already ran for you. So it's a lot easier. And we start looking at stuff and we start figuring out, like, for example, ooh, I want to 3-bet a lot more ace-x, right? I want to use these suited kings. I want to do all of that. I can't be defending as much passively, etc., etc. And then you can also try to figure out, let's say we had, what was the risk premium? It was 2.1. Let's find another spot where we'll have, it'll be low jack versus hijack here, right? So low jack versus hijack goes even higher. So what happens here? So we see a roughly similar composition for the 3-bet range. Here it's 12.7%, here it's 10.6%, so a bit tighter, but it's versus tighter open. And we see how that changes things. And to me, figuring out ICM and understanding how to play within ICM is basically this process iterated over and over and over again, and trying to divulge some sort of general principles of play. And we will make the next seminar sometime in the coming weeks, where we will go over a bit more into detail and try to give you guys specific ideas. But for now, our goal was not so much to get into the particulars, but to get into how we can use what we already have to get better ourselves. Because the thing is, even if we sat down today and we gave you like 10 things or like 10 rules to follow, whatever, they're still not going to be terribly useful to you, because ICM works in these really weird ways. And the only way to actually get better at it is by sitting down and studying them and developing a feel, if you want to call it, for the game and how things operate. Because otherwise you will be trying to mimic something which might actually be really different, because you saw this thing here at 40 and I'm going to click around and I can find another spot at similar stack depths where it's going to be a massively different thing, right? Like this, sorry, this is small line, but then, you know, it just changes so much and the assumptions change so much. This is again a 40 big blind effective spot, right? Like this one here. 40 bigs effective, the blinds are covered. You could say, it's basically very, very, very similar, but not exactly, because 6 max risk premiums will be lower. In general, yeah, that's a good point, that we'll look into how risk premiums develop across tournaments sometime in the future. But for now, you can only remember, you can just remember that you have the highest risk premium at the start of a final table. So 8 max, you see the highest risk premium, and usually that's where we really play the most conservative. Unless, of course, we're a massive chip leader and we push people around. But like mid stacks and short stacks in general play really conservative 8-handed. And as people start to bust out, risk premiums decrease. And you can see that here. So on the face of it, this spot here, you have, we're the mid stack with a bunch of mid stacks. This guy has a bit more than us. You know, we don't love getting 3-bet by the big stack, but we're also like, we can take risks, you know, if we bust him, get bigger stack, whatever, not bust him, but, you know, double up. Whereas here, we are second, but we have 4 people who are clearly shallower than us. You know, it's not like here, the 42 big blind cutoff has like 40 stack, 37, 35, you know, a bunch of stacks very close to them. It's 8 max, risk premium 17%. And here, it's a 6 max, a bunch of these shorties, and yet the risk premium with the cutoff faces versus the button is 15%, because it's shallower. And because of that, coming back to the strategies and why the only way to really get good at ICM is to just go through sims and develop feels for how things change, 8-handed, 6-handed, 4-handed, etc. So here you see that 1, the button is just shoving 40 bigs. They're just like, I don't care, I have ace-5, you can't call anything, I go all in. And they 3-bet a bit more, a bit lower in this section, because they have a jamming range. The value range is pretty similar, you know, slightly wider here, but the response is nothing like it, right? One, the shoving portion is just non-existent from the pairs. We call slightly more, but not by a lot, like slightly more, etc. Does this make sense? I've been talking for like 10 minutes and I'm not sure if any of what I said makes any sense.
Yeah, of course. I would stop you if it, if it didn't.
What about everybody else? Does it make sense? Am I just blubbering?
Yeah, where is the chat?
Yeah.
Show us the love. Send the love on the Discord chat, please.
Somebody's typing. Somebody's typing.
They are alive. You guys made small 3-bet sizes, or that stands on FTs? I'm in general, most of those ICM sims will have smaller 3-bet sizings because this is common stuff in the ICM. Like, yeah, the rule of thumb, the general rule is like all the sizings are going down, both pre-flop and post-flop, and you can accomplish basically the similar things but investing less chips, right, George?
Yeah, because of the risk premiums and all that we were talking so far, in general, you will see the way sizings will work. Post-flop, for example, because Paul mentioned that, is you'll see a lot more small betting, and then you'll see some very polarized bigger betting in certain scenarios. And those two things seem kind of very different. They are actually stemming from the same reason, and the reason is that because your equity thresholds will be higher, you either push advantages by putting in smaller bets because all the fringe combos can defend, or you're really trying to just deny equity and put all the money in. The way it works for pre-flop is, on the one hand, you have the small free bets. It's probably almost always going to be small free bets, especially below 40 bigs effective. You're going to see small betting. We've done a bunch of testing in the past about free bet sizes, and you're just not going to see a 3x 3 bet at 40 bigs on an FT because of how the solver thinks, because it has to already overfold. It just doesn't matter. It doesn't want to put too much money in the pot because then it has to play around with the threshold. So if it goes too big, it just can't. There are the opposite scenarios where out of position will be smaller than usual very often at shallower, like below 40 big blinds. You will see 3 to 3.5x being a lot more dominant than the usual 4 and higher in GPV. There are exceptions to the rule, but it's not exactly shallow, but a general exception to the 3-betting rule will be that if we're playing big stack versus big stack, we don't really want to 3-bet. We're playing extremely passive. And if we 3-bet, we're going to be 3-betting very big sizings. But let's say if we have 70 bigs versus 70 bigs or something, we're not going to make it 2.5 because the other guy can defend low. So we're going to be, but since we wouldn't want to 3-bet in the first place, letting you in.
You are in.
So yeah, you will see a lot of smaller 3-bets in general.
Yeah, it all comes back to the risk premium, and as you already mentioned, like those numbers, like for example 20%, it's about additional equity needed to invest all the chips, so for the all-in situations. And if we are playing more streets, this 20% is going to each of the streets proportionally to the chips that are invested. So yeah, if we 3-bet, obviously the risk premium on the guy is smaller than that 20%.
Yeah, that's the other very important thing, right? That a risk premium is applying across streets. No, keep asking questions. That's the point. That's why we're here, to ask questions and try to figure them out. When mid stacks 3-bet chip leader, the 3-bets are also small. Yes, because even though a chip leader can play more against the 3-bets, they still have risk premiums, unless we're talking about extreme scenarios where if you have a huge chip leader and you're, let's say somebody has 100 bigs and you have 20 and they open, that's a spot where you probably will have like almost only reshoves, and the small 3-bet or the non-all-in 3-bet will be like aces and one bluff from like ace 5 offsuit. So either the chip leader is not that big of a chip leader, and then we just get to play a strong 3-bet range, which with a small sizing is very efficient because one, they open too much and they can't defend, and two, we are playing a range which is still very balanced. Very often, the way the value portion works, let's say in GPV, 30 bigs, you won't be jamming your kings or your queens, whatever. You have button versus cutoff, 30 bigs. You're not jamming queens GPV ever. You want to get value. But here, especially below 40 bigs, the solver really wants to avoid playing post flop. So the way the ranges work will be a small value range, which is like the nuts and a few bluffs and a lot of jamming. And that's why you can still make it small, because when your range is aces and, you know, just a random example, if it's this range, you know, this is a completely different spot, but if your range is aces and ace 9 offsuit, it's fine for you to make it small because you want to get the EV from aces and you don't care if you get shoved on with ace 9, that sort of thing. Pablo, anything to add?
No, yeah. Of course, you're right. Like, yeah, obviously we can use different sizings in many of those situations, and the range will be a bit different for different sizings. It will be a bit stronger for the smaller size and a bit more polarized for the bigger size. Common situation that comes in mind here is like 3-betting from the big blind, where we are getting great price on a call, so we want our 3-bet to be extremely polarized. But yeah, again, general rule in ICM, we can use smaller sizings to accomplish similar things that we would do in GPV environment.
Yep. Yeah, and all spots like this, button 22, cutoff 40, you're just ripping in a lot, tiny 3-bets. And then if they phase the 3-bet, it doesn't matter to us. You know, there's so much junk in a wide chip leaders opening range that you don't need to make it 3x to fold their jack 7 suited, you know, or queen 9-0 or ace 7-0. Usually versus big stacks, the small 3-bet is basically targeting the very wide portions, just from a purely logical perspective, if that helps and is easier to understand. That's why the small still works, even versus a chip leader, because sure, they're a chip leader and they can bust us out, but they also just have 10-6 suited, you know, more often than they have aces. Or 10-6 suited is not a good example, but queen 8 off, because technically ace is more combos than 10-6 suited.
Yeah, like there are often those equity buckets for hands, and there's equity. And that additional risk premium is giving us this additional fold equity for those hands.
Yeah.
So we don't have to go much bigger.
Okay. And we have one more example here from the ones Pablo created. Again, similar stuff, how we use it. We look at GPV, we look at ICM. Even looking at this, you can already see a couple of things that you're going to see a lot in ICM scenarios. You have hijack open. Hijack is the chip leader here. Usually opening ranges with ICM will be very blocker heavy. You can see that here, right hand GPV 29.5%, a range that everybody's pretty used to. Opening deuces, etc. Opening queen six, opening 7-6, opening 6-5. And then here you have a 2% wider opening range, but it barely opens 6-5. It doesn't open the low pockets, but it opens every ace down to ace 3 off at a frequency. And again, this is not about remembering this exact range. This is about this whole thing where we compare heuristics and we try to figure out why some things are happening. Like button versus RFI, you know, a lot of calling GPV, but here because we have the button has a 15% risk premium, so we can't just defend everything. We have to, like, we lose this whole portion here. Oh, the 9-8 suited beautiful hands. We 3-bet a lot of blockers, etc., etc. Just the whole way of finding things out is important here. It's not so much the exact range. It's okay, let's look at this spot and try to figure out what drives it. Why does it happen? And because that's too much just mumbo jumbo, we have hands. The fun thing is that I'm not sure what we're gonna look at. So, but that was the initial plan. When we tried to figure out what we're gonna do, we thought that it might be useful to showcase how we study, you know, how we try to figure out spots, because let's face it, we're never gonna run a sim for every spot that we take. Very often, we just need to have a rough idea of what's happening. So what we're gonna do is I have a bunch of screenshots. I am an obsessive hand marker, which is useful. It's also useless.
Please show your folders. It's pretty amazing.
Check out. That's free alpha.
There is a reason you are playing the highest stakes, and this is one of the examples.
Yeah.
This is how you mark hands from your session, put it into different folders, topics, and then study them by topic, kind of.
Yeah, that's why it's very useful. A lot of these hands I'll probably never check, but I have a backlog where I want to study a certain topic. I just go to the folder, I open the folder, and I start studying. And that's great because instead of only looking at abstract concepts, which is very, very useful as well, there is a lot, we've done a lot of work with reports, we've done a lot of work of just looking through sims, but this type of tying a certain spot that you actually played to something that you're trying to learn is just emotionally, I'd say, more rewarding. You remember things better. So we're looking at my final table folder. And the last final table is from like almost 2 weeks ago, which is just really disappointing. But we have this spot, pretty standard spot. We have 20 bigs, and I'm not sure if I have the payouts. Okay, yeah, I have the payouts here. So these are the payouts. Pretty normal, standard GG structure in terms of percentages of 9th to 1st, about 10 times, and then yeah, you can click and take a screenshot in big blinds. Yeah, I know, man, but usually don't have. That's one extra click, you know. That's one extra click, and you have a lot of things to do. But that is more useful. Yeah, for sure. So here is the spot.
Okay.
We're trying to figure out
League Finder on the coach.
League Finder, that's good. I love it. I love it. That's how we gotta do it. That's why we're here, to ask questions and figure out answers. So, okay, before we try to find a sim which gives us information, what do you guys do here? We have 20 bigs. So the big blind is 20K. So we have 25, 40, 50, 23, 70, 25, and this guy has about 30 bigs. What do you do with king queen offsuit preflop? Do you limp? Do you raise? If you limp and face an ISO, I think we faced the 3x ISO. What do you do? How do you go about it? 97% range only raising normal in. You mean that you want to raise first in, or you want to limp and do something else? Because we're in small blind. Open jam 20. That is one solution. That is one solution. Just to quickly make a comparison, because it's a nice way to start. Let's see what GPV does at 20. This is GPV. Always X shoving, king queen half frequency, low pairs, and a bunch of non-all-in raising from the top, and then some of these 9 through 7x offsuit region. Open limp, limp shove, open limp to call. Okay, we have limp call, we have limp shove, we have open shove, we have everything. All right, now let's try to find a hand which is somewhat similar and see if we can get an answer to our question, or maybe not an answer, but you know, an idea. So let's say here, look at sims, we have a 24 big blind, 35 big blind, a lot of similar stacks, kind of what we have here. And let's see what big blind or small blind does here. Small blind first in, this 24 big, remember a bit, 4 big blinds deeper than we are. And we see that one, compared to the GPV, there is a lot less shoving, right? 2.5%. This is going to be very common. You're not going to see, with a number of similar stacks, you will see a lot less shoving from the small blind in a blind v blind scenarios at 20 bigs. When you go down to 15, depends on exact distributions, but just in general, because you have the risk premiums, because your equity thresholds are higher, you will see less shoving in general. The shoving on final tables, this is just, I'm making a short detour. In general, the high shove frequencies will be coming from stacks that cover other stacks. This is a big misconception that I see people doing that mistake over and over again all the time. They have like 15 bigs and they're uncomfortable and they don't know what to do, and they just start open shoving a lot and they're covered by everyone. That's not how it works. You play tighter when you have risk premiums, which means that you don't need to shove as much because your range is stronger. So to look at this ball, king queen here opens a lot. If we face an ISO in this scenario, 24 versus 35, we actually limp call. We don't want to shove that. We shove some aces. We really want to block calling ranges. And again, the difference to GPV is GPV, you get it in versus Jack 10, you're happy. Here, you don't want to get it in versus Jack 10. You really don't want to get it in versus Jack 10. You want to be blocking the calling ranges. So let's try to find another sim which is similar. We're looking again for 20-ish bigs. All right, we have another one here, a bunch of shorter stacks. Let's see, small blind first in, again, very little shoving, 24 bigs. Risk premium is 15%, which I would say is about what we have here, probably 12, 15%. And again, king queen, limping. Again, we see very similar structure. Suited aces raising, some low suited. And now let's say we face an ISO, and we see that king queen is again not a shove. We have the same thing, shoving aces. Just to confirm the risk premiums on the first team that we looked at, here we have 11%. So let's try to find a third same model. I already know that I fucked up the hand, but I'm just trying to show you guys how you can actually try to figure out things. So we had a spot, remember, we had a spot where we had 11% risk premium, and there was a little bit more open raising from like suited strong aces, and a little bit here in the offsuit strong king x department, a few low suited. And we had a 15% risk premium where we had a similar structure of the range, but slightly stronger. In both scenarios, the limp shoves were either some low pockets or ace-x. So I'm just going to find the third one. Here you go. This is a quite different scenario in terms of stack distributions. It's also six-handed. But Again, 13, this is ideal. So this is the mid risk premium between the two that we already looked at. And small blind first in, 20 bigs, a little bit more shoving because it's shorter handed in general, but still far away from what GPV does. And then first is the ISO. Again, it's just the aces. So this process is kind of how you can get heuristics, right? We just looked at one hand, which is fairly simple standard spot. And we can already tell that around 20 bigs, we're playing, let's call it mid versus mid. Our risk premium is between 10 and 15%. We have a very strong heuristic that if we're gonna be limping small blind fairly decent frequency. We're gonna be open raising as well some. Once we limp, we're just not limp shoving these here. We're just limp shoving aces, and that's it. And compare that to GPV, where a hand like king queen always the pockets always some king 5, king 4, king 3, etc. So there you go. Like we just spent what 8-10 minutes, I don't know, on this hand, and you can already get something out of it. And I think that's the way to really study ICM. And of course, you're gonna have a lot of scenarios that you can't answer by a ready-made sim. But when you start from here, you already save a bunch of time and you get a lot of ideas. And then if you have a very, very specific thing to ask, you go to the solver, and instead of just randomly running stuff that you have no clue, because this is a very side topic, but I think something that a lot of us are guilty of is running sims just to prove that they're right and not learning anything from them. So we're always trying, we're all guilty of that. We're all guilty of that, just being like, oh, darn, this guy, bluff catch me with this stupid hand.
And the pie shows 5% call. Yeah, I did it right, because when there is 5% call, it means that it's indifferent. So
yeah. So the good thing about starting your study like that is you avoid that bit, because you don't have the exact answer. You try to figure out the heuristic, and then if the spot is really different, really interesting, you go to HRC or you go to ICMizer or you go to Pio and you run the spot, and you have better idea of what it looks like. You have a better idea of what to input in the solver, etc., etc. How are you approaching spots in game when you're not sure what to do? King queen that you play again, you didn't see the charts, which you showed it. Well, how I approach spots is just generally the way I approach any spot in poker will be, first things I'll try to, in any scenario, I try to think of, I start from what does my range want to do, right? It could be pre-flop, it could be post-flop. I just try to figure out, okay, I'm in this spot and I have these stacks. These are the scenarios. This is the stage of the tournament. What does my range want to do? And then when I ask myself this question, I start thinking about heuristics. I start thinking about general ideas that I've sort of built upon while studying. And there is this tower of things that you build while you study, and you keep replacing stuff because you think that you understand something, and then you get some new information, etc. So the first thing I do is I try to look at that tower and be like, okay, where am I in that thing? How do if you're in high ICM playing aggressively passive, if your knowledge comes to conclusion that probably both options are fine. High ICM. Well, that's where you start thinking about your opponent, right? Because usually the way it works is you're almost never indifferent in reality, because you're playing versus humans and not versus the bot. So I would say that there is almost always a better decision, be it aggressive or passive. So
yeah, this is a very important comment, because again, we are trying to find those indifferent decisions when we solve the hand. But yeah, reality is not like that. Your opponents matters a lot.
So if I'm sitting there with king queen off in that exact hand, I did what I did because villain in this hand is a strong reg that we play with very often. And at the time I had the perception, we have a lot of dynamics. I play versus this guy every bloody day, right? And they play versus me every bloody day. So there is this dynamic. So in this exact king queen off scenario, I decided to play a limp shove because I had the belief that the big blind will be playing slightly more aggressively versus my limps, which may or may not have been true. So that's how I try to figure out, do I play aggressively or passive? Like, for example, if the big blind is a recreational who's never going to ISO, I'm probably just going to open raise this, you know, because I'm not trying to think about the exact solver solution, but more about how does my opponent play and how does that fit into a general strategy? I'm not sure if I'm answering the question exactly.
I think you do. I think you do.
A lot of people are typing. Let's see. I love it. I like it when people are typing. Makes me feel good. Yeah, sure. Unmute yourself, man.
Yeah, I need to.
Oh, pardon.
Okay, now you should be able to do so.
Okay, hello, do you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Okay, first, hello to everyone. My question is, okay, I understand that in game we are like finding better play versus specific opponent and never like randomizing and doing what you said, right? I totally get that and I totally agree. My question is more like, because in ICM, if we assume like one opponent is doing something and we decide that the response will be better to play more aggressively, and at the end, that's not the case. So we might blunder with assumptions so hard that like that most of the time we don't have like 2,000 or 5,000 hands to decide that maybe more aggressive line would be more appropriate, especially on GG, like there's no HUDs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you might assume your opponent is very aggressive, but he might in ICM play totally different poker.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, like, do you tend to go for like aggressive approach or more passive approach in that kind of spots? So for example, you know, king queen off is stacking like 20 blinds deep GPV, but here you're unsure like how he might approach. You know, he's aggressive like in GPV, but on ICM, in high ICM, you just can't have the sample like to really know. And if you assume wrong, you might make a huge blunder. Like I'm not saying like your king queen probably gets like it mostly calls. We didn't check the EV difference between shove and call. Yeah, like my question is, do you take more passive approach if you're not really sure in his tendency? Let's say it's unknown, like you know, it's unknown. Would you go for a more aggressive approach, like maybe raise like top range a little bit wider, or like would you like are you approaching by aggression when it comes to calling off or putting your life on the line, or you're like more passive in this type of spots? Or if you're not sure, you know, like queen 10 suited is jamming versus open, like for 20 blinds, he opens like hijack, you're on cutoff with 20, you know, it's usually profitable shove if he opens that and folds enough, right? Are you sometimes hitting this spot just because you're unsure of opponents? Like,
yeah, that's a very good question, actually. Now I understand. I kind of misunderstood your question. So I think it is worth thinking about some sort of a degree of certainty. So let's say you're not sure how your opponent plays, right? And you're in a spot and you have, as you said, an aggressive option and a passive option, roughly speaking. And I would try to think how convinced I am or how certain I am of certain assumptions, because we always make assumptions, right? So let's say this is the spectrum and I'm trying to think about it, and like this is aggression and this is passivity. And if I am really uncertain about something, I'm like, maybe this is a good spot to jam, to make the wider jam. I'll probably just fold because of how costly it can be if I can make a mistake. But so I'm trying to think in degrees of certainty at every point. So yes, in general, I always try to look for the aggressive options. as that's just how I try to think about the game. But that doesn't mean that if you're an aggressive player and you build your strategy around that, that doesn't mean that you have to always go for the aggressive option, but you're always trying to figure out how certain you are of something. Like, let's say, you can think of it whatever way you like. Like, the more mathematical people among us may try to think of it in terms of percentages. Like, let's say it's a spectrum between a 0 and 100. How convinced am I that I should be more aggressive here? And if I'm like 80% convinced, sure, just go with what you mentioned, like wider value open, etc. But if I'm 20% convinced, I would rather go back to a closer to what I think a GTO option would look like in that spot, which is very often going to be passive in an ICM environment, or vice versa. Let's say that I'm in the big blind and I have ace deuce offsuit, and the solver friggin' loves to reshove ace deuce offsuit from the big blind in ICM for like infinite big blinds. You'll see like 50 bigs, let's go. If I'm sitting there and I have ace deuce offsuit, and I'm on a final table where I have 4 unknown players and one of them opens into me, like, in order for me, I know that I can reshove ace deuce offsuit in a GTO environment, but I also know that in order for that play to work, this player has to fold ace king offsuit. So, and again, we get to what you described. I don't know how that player plays, and you're making the fair assumption that people are just not going to be folding ace king. So I know that now here is what the GTO is, but I also make the assumption that my opponent is not going to be, or I have a fairly high certainty that they're not going to be making the correct play, which makes my play bad, etc. So I think trying to always think of how convinced am I, and in general, if you're going to be risking your tournament life, or if you're going to be making a massive play, try to make these big plays in spots where your conviction level is fairly high. And then it doesn't matter if you bust. It doesn't matter if it doesn't even matter if you make a massive blunder, but you're in a spot and you have a conviction level which is fairly high, and you make the play and it doesn't work out. You can at least go back to that spot and be like, okay, I had a fairly high conviction that I can be really aggressive in this scenario, and the solver says that I'm wrong. So what of my assumptions was incorrect? And then when you go through that process, you actually learn stuff, because you know what was your logic, and that's very important. That's like thing number 1, understand why you're doing things. And then why was that logic wrong? So the next time you'll figure it out. Whereas if you go for aggression for the sake of aggression, or you go for passivity for the sake of passivity, you end up making blunders and not knowing why you made the blunder. Because if you just blanketly say, I'm going to be aggressive in general versus unknowns because ICM, you're going to be making mistakes and you're not sure what was the mistake. Does all of that make sense? Just the whole idea of spectrum of certainty to allow you to move between aggressive action, passive action. Some guy told me, I'm reading from the chat, if you have no idea how your hand plays, just fold in ICM. Yeah, that's, in general, that's not the worst advice, because folding makes you money. Yeah, just don't fold aces also because you're not sure if you want a 3-bet or jam, please. Don't do that. Do regs overbeating guys.
There's also saying that if you play aggro, you have one more way of winning the hand, right? That's another perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that was a nice question, and yeah, like you mentioned, like 2K sample or something, which will not ever happen, probably even on stars, because when you play ICM, the stacks are different and the situation is always different, and we don't have stats on GG and stuff. So that's why I think it's very important to pay attention on the table and what people are showing down, because even if our like sample is low, we still can get a lot of information from it. Like from the math or statistic perspective, there is this Bayesian effect. I'm not sure how to say it in English, but like even the really low samples can give us some degree of certainty. So yeah, paying attention to the table, and even like 5 hands, 5 showdowns can give us a lot of information, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
That's
for sure. I agree with that. Like, even one showdown gives you information, you know, it gives you ideas of how people think about the game. And that is where you really can start to beat the game, when you understand how certain players think in certain ways, even at the highest stakes. Like, if you sit down and watch like the super high roller bowl that, you know, the beasts be playing 25, 50Ks, 100Ks, and you have different player profiles, even there, although most of these guys are so close to perfect poker that, you know, it's really hard to get any EV from them. Even there, you see different playing styles. You see people thinking differently about the game. So that can, you know, just really pay attention. Really pay attention to how people think. We have a couple of questions. Let's try to answer them. The regs over abusing ICM, and they can be easily to exploit this type of spots from your experience. Again, what we just mentioned, there are different player types, and really try to pay attention to how people play. Even between strong regs, there are different styles of play. Usually, if you notice something, take a note, like just click here, make a note, because you won't remember it in 1 month. How people perceive it, like you will see players who really don't care about ICM, you'll see players who are really, like, a very common scenario amongst strong players is they are a little bit too aggressive as a big stack and a little bit too passive as a mid stack. So if I have to make a huge generalization, but again, this is just a huge generalization, is never going to be perfectly accurate, but if I have to make one, I would say that a lot of people maybe go a little bit out of line with big stack, and they are a bit too scared as a mid stack, and they definitely very often play a bit too tight as a very short stack as well. I guess they play with, yeah. In stakes between 100 and 300 USD, do you think it's okay to play more aggressively and try to run over the table, or do you think you still have to respect your opponents? I would say that most tables in these stakes will allow you to, as you put it, run over the table. I think you should always respect your opponents in terms of just in general as an approach to poker. But yes, at these stakes, you will very often find yourselves in scenarios where people will not play back at you too much, or they will play back at you in the wrong ways. So again, pay attention, and just there are many scenarios depending on the seed draw, etc., where, for example, maybe the chip leader is just not taking advantage and they're not putting enough pressure on, and then you're the 4th stack, but you can effectively play like the chip leader, etc. Just try to notice who are the people that are like really just trying to ladder up, and at these stakes you see a lot of that, and go after them. And like a lot of small free betting, a lot of make people feel uncomfortable, and at these stakes you can make people feel a lot more uncomfortable, because probably you will see a smaller amount of really well studied people. So I think you, again, as an overall generalization, yes, you can run over tables a lot more, but that doesn't mean that every time you find yourself at a final table of a $200 tournament, you should walk in with the assumptions, ooh, I'm going to run over these guys, you know, I'm going to show them who's boss. Again, just pay attention to the table. Very often you will have these opportunities, but don't just blanketly enter into that. And one last one. We have Pat joining, I guess he's. Hey, Pat, we're about to just wrap it up. I guess there was some misunderstanding with the time zones.
We're gonna have the recording, I hope, and we're gonna put it somewhere on the website.
Yeah, Pat is an old friend of ours, so yeah, always love to see him.
The old max value crew, huh?
Yeah.
The beginnings, at least for some of us, or the resurrection for the others.
All right, we have one more question. Let's just go through that as well. You learned from all sims we looked into that we call king queen over slicing this spot. Would you ever deviate on why based on what information? Yeah, exactly what we start with. And yes, of course, I would deviate, and I'll deviate if I believe that the most common scenario where I'll deviate is if I believe that the big blind is ISOing more than they could, because sure, they cover us in that spot, but it's not like they can just push us over because the guy only has like 10 bigs more than us. He's not looking to stack off ace-5, you know? So it's going to be similar. If I believe that this villain is ISOing a bit more, I'll just play the limp shift very, very often. And again, with an offsuit combination, more likely to do it. If I think that big blind is overdoing it, I would, if it was a suited combination, I wouldn't, just because it plays really well post flop. Offsuit combinations generally will be realizing equity a bit worse. Okay, we have a random question. I love random questions. When someone is really short on the big blind, you open bigger or still 2x. In an ICM environment, you don't need to open bigger, because if the big blind is really short and they have to be tight anyways, and there is a risk premium, you just, especially if you're a big stack, you don't need to open bigger. If you're in a GPV environment, yeah, always open bigger versus a short big blind, but not in ICM. You just don't need to. They already have a huge ICM tax on them, so you don't need to do that. All right, I guess we got to wrap it up, right? Pavel said 1 hour.
Yeah, I said 1 hour because I believe 1 hour is like this magic point when you start losing like focus, awareness, attention, spam, yada yada. So I think doing those maybe more frequently, but sticking to 1 hour is the way to go. It still sucks because we said hands. And
we said, okay, let's do at least one more hand. Let's do at least one more
for
hand.
the sake of being right.
For the sake of being right, yeah. I'm not sure if we have a spot like this though. I wanted to run this one because see, now sometimes you find spots like this where even the huge library won't answer your question, but again, let's try to figure out. So we need big stack, the big blind.
Brazilian and Chinese flags behind.
This guy is irregular.
With a Chinese blood in his veins, so
okay, let's try this one.
He's not gonna be on the passive side.
So button versus big blind, 14%. Let's try this one. People are already saying bye. I'm gonna first check this one before we end it.
Like without looking at the sim, right? In general, are we raise folding to the bigs and raise calling the small blind?
But sevens is just such a brutal.
It's one of the worst.
I think we want to have some jams here, even though we earlier said yes, there is a lot less.
Yeah, probably from the cutoff already.
From the cutoff, I think we have jams, and I think we kind of actually jam this type of hand. I think we jam like 7s, 8s, 9s, and then probably open 10s and higher, and then jam some suited stuff.
5-handed, so the risk premiums are lower, but then the amount of ante in the middle is a bit smaller.
The question
there
is
are always those contradicting arguments, right?
The question is here that I'm unsure, do I just skip the spot and take screenshot? Really depends, depends on the table, depends on, again, on my conviction levels. In game, if I remember correctly, I felt like 7s was just about good enough, and I was like fairly convinced that I can get it in. So I had like probably 75% conviction, so I got it in. And then if I had 6s, I would have very likely folded and taken a screenshot still. Oh, someone waiting. Last minute. Okay, let's see the range and let everyone go do other things. So this is a very different scenario, right? You have 18 bigs, but you do have a smaller stack, and you do have a couple of middling stacks, which is one more than we have here, and we have the chip leader in the big blind. So we have a fairly similar scenario in some sense. And if you look at the shape of a range, this is from the button, of course. So from the cutoff, I'll imagine we definitely lose this portion here. So my assumption was that the shoves move a bit higher to around here and then shove this bit and open some aces. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It is, again, not so much about answering the exact question here, but about learning how to think about spots and how to try and find answers. We need more 5 max sims, Pavel.
Okay. Noted.
All right. I think it's 1 hour and 10. And now that we've had 2 hands instead of 1.
Yep. So what's the answer in this one? What did you do?
The answer is, see, this is the answer where, okay, we have a general idea of how it looks like. But this is a type of spot where, okay, my guess is 7s are a shove from looking at these sims. And just in general, I can find like a 15 big blind cutoff spot or something and try to look at that. Although, again, it's more about risk premiums than exact stack sizes. So this is a different one, but it has 11% risk premium versus big blind and 12 versus small blind, which should be fairly similar to what we have versus the respectively button and big blind. And again, we see this type of shoving range where, again, button, I'll imagine this portion is lost. So I'll say that 7s are a shove by looking at these sims. And then maybe I go into HRC and solve my exact hand and see what are the changes.
Yeah, I like the gem. Yeah, you convinced me to do it too, I guess.
So I would say, looking at the sims and looking at how ranges are being built, I'll say it's gem.
All right.
Hope you guys had fun.
That was a good one. I really love how many people we got on the first one, because probably most of our users didn't even notice that we are running a Webby. So having at this hour so many people is great, and thank you for being so active and asking questions on the chat. Thank you, George, for the amazing content. All the participants, please send us feedback or ideas for the future events. We might need to do a couple more in the future, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe we will able to do one more before the scoop starts, right? ICM is pretty important topic because some of you will get to the final tables during that series. So yeah, we will provide some. For now, thank you all. And good luck at the tables.
Have fun. Good luck and good night. Great movie. It's good night and good night. The other way around. Great movie,
Great
nevertheless. Go check it out.
You deserve it after
Yeah.
70 minutes of studying today.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, Pat. Hope to see you around next time.
All right.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye, everybody.